Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Wednesday, everybody. First up, the economy, and we start with concerning news related to government revenue. According to official numbers published by the Ministry of Finance yesterday, Tuesday, China's national fiscal revenue contracted 1.9% year-on-year in July, while income from land sales for local governments fell by the largest in 2 years. National fiscal revenue fell by 2.6% in the first 7 months of 2024. The drop in revenue has to do with slow economic growth as well as the government's decision to cut taxes and fees in the middle of last year to support growth, the ministry said. Without this special factor, it says, revenue would have climbed 1.2% over the period. As regular viewers know from other recent official data releases, this news comes as China is grappling with weak industrial production and sluggish consumption. And of course, China has seen years of deepening fiscal deficits already. In July, national general public budget expenditure grew by 6.6% year-on-year. The years-long slowdown in property is causing the most pain as well. Income from land use sales, a critical source of extra budgetary revenue for local governments, fell an incredible 40.3% year-on-year, marking the steepest decline since July 2022 and a 5 percentage point larger drop from June. Revenue from land sales fell 22.3% in the first 7 months, dragging down the budgetary revenue of government-managed funds by 18.5% in the first 7 months of the year. Corporate income tax revenue fell for a third straight month, decreasing by 4.9% year-on-year in July. In a note, Goldman Sachs Group Inc. economists explained, quote, "We see significant downward pressure for fiscal funding this year from falling tax and land sales revenue, besides the multi-year deleveraging by local government financing vehicles." End quote. This all comes amid intensifying calls for Beijing to ramp up fiscal stimulus to support the $17 trillion economy and to raise this year's official deficit ceiling to allow more central government borrowing. Late last year, China lifted the ratio to 3.8% of gross domestic product from the original 3%, with the sales of an additional 1 trillion yuan of sovereign bonds. Unfortunately, too, the fiscal situation may be much worse than the official numbers suggest. Yesterday, Tuesday, Chinese financial media outlet The Economic Observer published a report discussing the issue of inflated fiscal revenues. Citing an investigation into audit reports, the piece highlights how some local governments have been artificially increasing their fiscal revenues. The report argues that this is being driven by pressures from high-level government assessments, local government rankings, and debt reduction directives. Quote, "Recently, some local audit departments have publicly released their 2023 budget audit reports. These reports mention that some local governments have significantly inflated their fiscal revenues and engaged in financial transfers. For example, the audit report of Sichuan province states that some regions included directed donation funds into the same level of finance, inflating fiscal revenue by 41.51 million yuan. The audit report of Qinghai province points out that the provincial finance in 2023 transferred 20 million yuan of previously allocated funds from previous years into the general public budget, inflating the financial capacity of that year. A person working in the fiscal audit department of a local audit office stated that during the audit process, a significant gap was found between fiscal revenue and actual financial capacity, which is due to the inflated revenue." End quote. Meanwhile, while we're on the economy, yesterday, Tuesday, also saw the publication of new economic numbers from the National Bureau of Statistics. According to the data, China's industrial policies rose for a 4th straight month in July, with profits in China's industrial firms rising 4.1% in July from a year earlier, accelerating from the 3.6% growth recorded in June. The earnings haul is a key gauge of the financial health of factories, mines, and utilities across China that can affect their investment decisions in the months to come. In the first 7 months of the year, industrial profits rose 3.6% from a year earlier, which compared with the 2.3% drop recorded for the whole of 2023. Now we note these are official numbers, and so we take them with a grain of salt. Though commentators still view China's economic fundamentals as weak, the industrial profit growth suggests that Beijing's manufacturing drive is starting to bear some fruit. The devil is in the details, however. Roughly half of China's industrial sectors recorded stronger profits in the first 7 months of this year, with heavily subsidized industries pulling up the average. For example, earnings in the lithium battery and semiconductor subsectors grew 45.6% and 16% respectively during the January through July period. Many sectors are seeing protracted industrial deflation weighing on profits. The producer price index fell 0.8% year-on-year in July, the 22nd straight month of decline. Even the National Bureau of Statistics spokesperson admitted with the numbers yesterday, quote, "Domestic demand has remained relatively weak, and the external environment is turning complicated and prone to changes. The foundation of industrial profit recovery still needs to be consolidated." End quote. Next up, regular viewers will remember several weeks ago a cooking oil scandal blew up across China after a local state-run paper published a blockbuster story about tankers used for transporting chemical fuel being used for transporting cooking oil as well, often without cleaning between switching loads. At the time, this was being discussed as China's biggest public scandal in a decade. The public outcry from the scandal was significant. Soon after the story was published, the National Public Order and Narrative Control apparatus went into overdrive. We covered that at the time. Now the investigation has been completed exactly as many expected. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin reports that authorities have punished 10 individuals and 7 companies involved in the case. The 2 drivers implemented in the case have been placed under criminal investigation, and the 3 individuals responsible for falsifying the cleaning records were punished with a 10-day administrative detention. 5 others, including the legal representatives and owners of the transportation fleets, have also been punished, although the statement did not specify their penalty. Incredibly, or perhaps not so incredibly for those familiar with Beijing's MO in the face of public scandals, despite reports of widespread practices, the report issued by the Food Safety Office under China's State Council said investigators had confirmed that only 2 truckloads of oil had indeed been exposed to fuel, and that, quote, "a thorough probe into the cooking oil supply chain has so far found no evidence of a systemic problem with regard to safety standards in the trucking industry." End quote. The report added that the authorities had carried out a nationwide rectification campaign across the cooking oil supply chain, which did not identify any other cases of trucks being used to transport fuel and cooking oil without being cleaned. Shortly after the findings were published on Sunday, a commentary in party mouthpiece, The People's Daily, said the investigation reflected Beijing's, quote, "highly responsible attitude to food safety and its high-pressure stance on continuing to crack down on criminal and illegal acts involving food." End quote. News of the investigation results were met with derision by some China commentators. Quote, "The investigation into the contaminated cooking oil scandal has completed as expected. A handful of bad apples have been detained, relatively small fines were given to 2 large companies, and the problems were found to be isolated rather than nationwide. Some local officials may be investigated for corruption. So, problem resolved. Your cooking oil is safe." End quote. Next up, we have one more economic development to cover, but just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are huge helps. It tells the algorithm that this is content worth showing to new people. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description for those who want to go the extra mile and help keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much. Next up, we're going to examine an opinion piece published today by Robin Harding, the Asia editor for UK-based The Financial Times, called "China's Debt Divide." The piece touches on themes discussed in part 1 of today's video. We will end today's video by quoting selected excerpts from the piece directly. In 1975, Zhou Enlai, the first premier of the People's Republic of China, declared proudly that his government was free from all debt. In contrast to the economic turmoil and inflation in the capitalist world, He told the National People's Congress, "We have maintained a balance between our national revenue and expenditure and contracted no external or internal debts." Almost half a century later, that attitude is still written on the hearts of finance ministry bureaucrats in Beijing. China's central government debt has crept up to about 24% of gross domestic product, which is minimal by global standards, and the leadership is deeply reluctant to let it climb higher. Yet in contrast, the debts of China's local governments are vast, 93% of GDP according to IMF figures, which are probably an underestimate, and rising. This division between central and local government, and the desire of one to have control but not responsibility with respect to the other, is fundamental to the economic challenges of China today. A basic fact about China's fiscal system is that local governments do almost all the spending, but rely on the center for revenue to an extent that is rare elsewhere in the world. Localities bear most of the responsibility for education, health, social security, and housing, in addition to obvious local duties such as roads, parks, and rubbish collection, and spend about 85% of the government total. They directly collect only around 55% of the government revenues. The system is balanced by transfers from the central government to the regions. In a country as large as China, there are merits to devolving decisions closer to the people, but the mismatch between revenue and expenditure creates many problems. For example, the lower down the pyramid of governance, the more the system gets starved of resources, because each tier, province, prefecture, county tends to hold back what it needs before passing cash onward down the chain. The implementation of central government spending plans is haphazard. Meanwhile, local government officials, who must deliver growth to climb the bureaucratic ranks, do whatever they can to find money. China's property boom was partly driven by the reliance of local governments on land sales for revenue. Off-the-books borrowing by so-called local government financing vehicles was a way to get around the revenue constraint and fund infrastructure. As land sales slump due to the housing slowdown and the central government cracks down on local borrowing, there are many reports of municipalities resorting to fines and penalties, launching retrospective tax investigations, or simply not paying staff on time as they struggle to balance their books. None of this is good for the struggling private sector. Beijing knows all about these structural problems and has long aspired to fix them. Indeed, when Xi Jinping first came to power in 2012, fiscal reform was a big part of his domestic policy agenda, elements of which he delivered. Part of the reason why local governments are struggling, for example, is the success of reforms to budgetary management and financial administration, which made it harder to paper over problems by shifting them off the books. What the central government has not been willing to do, as is typical for Xi, is surrender control. It often specifies the services that local governments must provide, yet declines to hand over the revenue sources that fund them. It is reluctant to take big new spending responsibilities onto the central books. It has cracked down on local government debt, and yet, true to Zhou's preferences, it is unwilling to let central government debt rise instead. The result has been a de facto fiscal tightening during the past few years, even as the economy has struggled to recover after COVID. At the recent third plenum, Beijing promised to change this. It said it would give local governments more control over taxes and increase fiscal transfers from the center. It will consider rolling various local surcharges into a single local tax. It will move the liability for consumption tax from manufacturers to retailers and let local governments collect it, which would be an important reform. Where the central government has more fiscal power, it will raise the proportion of central government expenditure accordingly. This is exactly what is needed. Yet, China has set out a similar direction of travel in the past, not least during lengthy debates about whether to introduce property taxes, a natural way for local governments to fund local spending. If Beijing is actually going to implement these plans, it will have to surrender some control. And if it is to do so while reviving the stagnant economy, it will also have to accept a rise in the central government's debt. In his 1975 speech, Zhou Enlai made several other declarations. "We must resolutely support the centralized leadership of the party," he said. "We must work hard, build the country, and run all undertakings with diligence and thrift." Centralization and thrift. Neither is an easy habit to surrender, and in that lies the challenge. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a great Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.